All right, so let's dive into this story. It's practically ripped from the pages of like a royal soap opera. We're
Oh,
talking about Paul I of Russia, son of the legendary Catherine the Great, you know,
yeah.
eh,
Hmm.
the empress who like expanded Russia's borders and embraced Enlightenment ideals. But what about the son who lived in her shadow? This is a story about family drama, political intrigue, and a legacy forever overshadowed.
Yeah, it's really striking how much Paul's life was shaped by his mother's ambition. It's almost Shakespearean. We're working from an episode of the Noble Blood podcast, and it paints a vivid picture of a man struggling to forge his own path while haunted by his family's past.
Okay, so set the scene for us. We've got Catherine the Great, this powerful empress who just seems larger than life. Where does Paul fit into this picture?
Well, imagine being born into a loveless marriage, practically ripped away from your mother at birth, and raised by your power-hungry great aunt, Empress Elizabeth. That was Paul's reality. Catherine showed little interest in him, focused as she was on consolidating her own power.
Yeah, that's got to leave a mark. I mean, talk about an unstable childhood. What kind of impact did this have on Paul?
It's hard to say for certain, but I think it's safe to assume that this early separation and lack of maternal affection contributed to his insecurities and later his paranoia.
It's almost like he spent his entire life trying to earn his mother's approval, but she just kept pushing him further away.
Exactly. And things only get worse when Paul is 7 years old. He witnesses his mother orchestrating a coup. That overthrows his father, Peter III. Now, officially, Peter died of apoplexy. But many historians believe that Catherine was complicit in his death, perhaps even ordering it.
Wow, to witness something like that at such a young age, it's no wonder he grew up to be distrustful and suspicious.
Absolutely. And that event casts a long shadow over their relationship. Catherine sees Paul as a potential threat to her power. She works tirelessly to control him, manipulating his life, and frankly treating him more like a rival than a son.
So how did Catherine go about controlling Paul? What were some of the ways she kept him sidelined?
She micromanaged his life for starters. She arranged his marriages. His first wife, Wilhelmina, died in childbirth, and Catherine swiftly arranged a second marriage to Sophia Dorothea, who became Maria Feodorovna. It's as if she wanted to ensure he was always under her thumb.
That's incredibly controlling. It sounds like she never saw him as a capable leader in his own right.
You hit the nail on the head. She even went so far as to favor Paul's own son, Alexander, as her heir apparent, further humiliating and alienating Paul. Talk about a dysfunctional family dynamic.
So what happens when Catherine finally dies? Did Paul just sweep in and take over as like a more mature and experienced ruler?
Not exactly. He was 42 when he finally ascended to the throne, but he took over with a burning desire to dismantle his mother's legacy. He was determined to break free from her shadow, even in death.
Okay, I've heard some pretty wild stories about what he did. He really went all out in erasing her influence, didn't
Oh,
he?
absolutely. One of the first things he did was destroy Catherine's will. He also changed succession laws to favor male heirs, directly undermining her wishes.
Yeah. I remember reading that he even had the remains of Catherine's lover, Grigory Potemkin, exhumed and scattered. That's a pretty bold move.
It certainly is. It speaks volumes about the resentment and bitterness he harbored. He also reversed many of Catherine's pro-French policies. He banned French books and fashion. He even outlawed certain French words. You see, Paul was deeply suspicious of the French Revolution and feared that its ideas would spread to Russia.
So his paranoia wasn't just directed at his family.
Not at all. It extended to external threats, political rivals, and even his own court. Remember, he grew up in a world where power was often seized through violence and intrigue. He was always looking over his shoulder, expecting the next betrayal.
Yeah, this fear and suspicion seem to have manifested in some pretty interesting ways during his reign. Tell me about his obsession with the military.
Ah, yes, the military. Paul was absolutely fixated on military discipline, specifically the Prussian model. He enforced strict drills and uniforms. He even introduced new, often impractical hairstyles and clothing regulations for his soldiers. It drove his troops crazy.
And his reputation for erratic behavior and those sudden violent outbursts. Were those just rumors, or was there some truth to them?
There's definitely some truth to those stories. There are numerous historical accounts of Paul flying into rages over seemingly minor things. He would often punish people harshly for the slightest infractions. This behavior, combined with his paranoia, led to whispers of insanity within his own court.
It's almost like he was trapped in a cycle of fear and control. He wanted to create order and stability, but his methods just ended up alienating everyone around him.
That's a great observation. And this brings us to one of the most telling examples of his paranoia, the Palace of St. Michael.
Right. The palace he had built because he was so convinced people were plotting against him. It's almost like something out of a Gothic novel, isn't it? A fortress designed to keep the world out.
Exactly, complete with a moat and drawbridge. It was a physical manifestation of his anxieties. He believed that he needed this elaborate fortress to protect himself from his enemies, both real and imagined.
It's almost tragic, really. He spent his entire life living in fear. And in the end, his fears were realized.
Indeed. And the irony, of course, is that he met his end in that very palace, the one he thought would keep him safe.
So tell me about his assassination. What exactly happened that night in the Palace of St. Michael?
Well, on March 23, 1801, a group of disgruntled officers, fueled by resentment and possibly alcohol, stormed into Paul's bedroom.
So they just barged into his bedroom in the middle of the night. What were they hoping to achieve?
It's believed that their initial plan was to force Paul to abdicate. They even brought documents for him to sign. But the situation escalated quickly. There was a struggle, and Paul was brutally killed.
And just like that, his reign was over. What a dramatic end to a life filled with drama. What happened next?
Paul's son Alexander, the one Catherine favored, became the new czar. It's believed that he was aware of the plot against his father, but not that it would result in murder.
Imagine the guilt he must have carried, knowing he indirectly benefited from his father's death. What a heavy burden to bear.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history is full of these moral complexities. There are rarely clear-cut heroes and villains.
So we've talked about the trauma of Paul's childhood, his strained relationship with Catherine, his paranoia and eccentricities as a ruler. But is there anything more to his story? Did he achieve anything positive during his reign?
Well, it's important to remember that Paul wasn't simply a tyrant driven by fear and resentment. He genuinely believed he was acting in the best interests of Russia. He actually made some attempts at social reform, particularly aimed at improving the lives of serfs.
Really? That's surprising considering his reputation for being authoritarian and out of touch. Tell me more about these reforms.
He tried to limit the power landowners had over their serfs, including restricting the number of days they could be forced to work. He also established orphanages and hospitals for the poor. These efforts were met with resistance from the nobility, who saw it as an attack on their privileges.
It's interesting that he would try to help the serfs while simultaneously clamping down on freedoms in other areas. What was his thinking there?
It seems contradictory, doesn't it? But remember, Paul was a complex figure. He was deeply concerned about social unrest and believed that a strong centralized government was necessary to maintain order. He may have seen improving the lives of serfs as a way to prevent potential uprisings.
It's a reminder that even rulers who are considered oppressive can sometimes have a paternalistic side. They might genuinely believe they are doing what's best for the people, even if their methods are misguided.
Precisely, and Paul's motivations were always intertwined with his desire to break free from his mother's legacy. He wanted to be seen as a just and compassionate ruler, in stark contrast to Catherine, who is often perceived as ruthless and power-hungry.
Speaking of breaking free from his mother's legacy, didn't he have this unusual fascination with chivalry? It seems a bit out of place for a Russian emperor. Where did that come from?
Ah, yes, his obsession with chivalry. It's one of the more peculiar aspects of his reign. Paul idealized the knights of old, their code of honor and loyalty. He even tried to instill these ideals in his court, forcing his advisors to adopt a code of conduct based on medieval chivalry.
Why, seriously?
Yeah.
Like bowing and dealing and stuff. I can't imagine that went over well with his advisors.
You can imagine the eye rolls. But for Paul, it was more than just a quirky interest. It was a way for him to create a courtly atmosphere. That harkened back to a bygone era, an era that predated his mother's reign. It was almost like he was trying to rewrite history, to create a narrative where his father, Peter III, was the hero and Catherine the villain.
It's fascinating how personal experiences can shape a ruler's worldview. He was trying to project this image of strength and honor, perhaps to compensate for the weakness and betrayal he felt as a child.
Exactly. And his fascination with chivalry also tied into his efforts to weaken the aristocracy. Remember, these were the very people who had supported Catherine's rise to power. He saw them as a threat, just as he saw his mother as a threat.
So in a way, he was fighting the same battles his father had fought. Even though his father was long gone, he was trying to reclaim his family's honor and establish his own legitimacy as a ruler.
That's a very insightful observation. And it highlights the cyclical nature of history. Often rulers are not just responding to the events of their own time, but also grappling with the ghosts of the past.
It's almost like Paul was destined to repeat the cycle of paranoia and control that had plagued his family for generations.
Perhaps. But it's also important to recognize that he wasn't entirely defined by his negative traits. He had a vision for Russia, a vision of order and justice, even if his methods for achieving it were often misguided.
So despite his eccentricities and his tragic end, is it fair to say that Paul left a lasting impact on Russia?
Absolutely. His reign, though brief and turbulent, had a profound impact on the country's political landscape. His efforts at social reform, however limited, planted the seeds for future change, and his descendants went on to rule various European countries, highlighting his lasting genetic legacy.
It's amazing how even the most controversial figures in history can leave such a complicated and multifaceted legacy. It's a reminder that we should always strive to understand the full picture, to see beyond the stereotypes and caricatures.
Well said. And it's important to remember that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry woven from the lives and experiences of real people, flawed and fascinating in equal measure.
And speaking of fascinating people, you mentioned that Paul's descendants went on to rule other European countries. That's incredible. Can you tell me more about his family's legacy?
Yeah, it really is amazing to think about how one man's lineage can spread so far and wide. It really underscores how interconnected European history is.
It really is fascinating. For instance, Paul's granddaughter, Alexandra, married Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII of England. That means Paul is a direct ancestor of Queen Elizabeth II. Talk about a family tree.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. So even though Paul himself might be a relatively obscure figure to many people, his bloodline has had a significant impact on world history.
Exactly. And it speaks to the ripple effects of history. Even individuals who might not be household names can have a surprisingly wide-reaching impact.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Paul I's life, what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners? I think it's the importance of context. It's easy to judge historical figures based on our modern values, but we need to remember that they lived in different times, with different norms and challenges.
It's like you said earlier, there are rarely clear-cut heroes and villains in history.
Right. Paul was a product of his time and his upbringing, his childhood trauma, his complicated relationship with his mother, the political climate of his era. All of these factors contributed to his personality and his actions as a ruler.
It's a reminder that we should approach history with empathy and nuance, trying to understand the complexities of human motivation, rather than simply labeling people as good or bad.
Exactly. And I think Paul's story also highlights the cyclical nature of power. He spent his life trying to escape the shadow of his mother, yet he ended up repeating many of the same patterns of paranoia and control. It raises interesting questions about the nature of leadership and the challenges of breaking free from inherited legacies.
It's almost as if the weight of history itself can be a burden on those who wield power.
That's a very poetic way of putting it, and I think it gets to the heart of what makes Paul's story so compelling. It's a tragedy, yes, but it's also a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and the challenges of forging one's own identity in the face of overwhelming historical forces.
So for our listener who's now completely fascinated by Paul I, where should they go from here if they want to learn more?
Well, as we mentioned, the Noble Blood podcast episode is a great starting point. It's a very accessible and entertaining way to get acquainted with Paul's story.
And for those who want to delve even deeper, there are a number of excellent biographies and historical analyses of Paul I and his reign. I highly recommend exploring those resources to gain a more nuanced understanding of this complex figure.
Absolutely. And as you explore, keep in mind that there's still much debate among historians about Paul's motivations and his mental state. Some argue that he was genuinely insane, while others believe that his eccentricities were a calculated political strategy. There's no easy answer, and that's what makes historical research so fascinating.
It's like a historical puzzle waiting to be solved.
Precisely. And each new piece of evidence we uncover adds another layer to our understanding of Paul I, a man who was both a product of his time and an enigma that continues to fascinate us centuries later.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the life and legacy of Paul I of Russia. A tragic figure, a complex ruler, a man forever overshadowed by his mother's legacy, yet one whose story offers us valuable insights into the human condition and the enduring allure of history.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. And remember, there are countless fascinating stories hidden within the annals of history, waiting to be uncovered and explored. Keep questioning, keep researching, keep diving deep.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating corner of history.